Hi, everybody, and thanks for that great welcome. My name is Brenda Romero, and today I am going to talk to you about the metaverse. So they said it was going to be amazing, absolutely amazing. And the time is absolutely now, if ever there were a time. As we sat locked down, cooped up, trapped in, stilted, and stopped, as we stared at our coworkers or connected with family and friends, they thought, you know what? We're nearly there, and they meant it, like not just wonderfully close to the end of this whole thing, but to a technological reality we have never before known. The things we thought we couldn't do online, absolutely no way, not a chance, you absolutely have to go into the doctor's office to see your doctor, suddenly actually became possible. From doctors to pharmacies to education, the speed of technological adoption and adaptation in every single field was on extreme fast forward, to say the very least. And we'd arrived. We had arrived. We were finally in the metaverse that so many people had talked about, this convergence of our physical reality with a digital space, a virtual shared space. This is something that we've been heading toward for years. And we were finally there. Now, we got there a way we didn't really want to get there, but we had arrived. And one absolutely enhanced the other. We had AR, VR, and we were all online, and they couldn't wait, right? Like people were running toward this, especially the tech giants. Everybody was really, really excited about this. You could see the buzzwords happening all over the place. And I watched them go. I absolutely watched them go. As a super tech head myself, man, you would think I'd be running right along with them, but I'm not. Because hold up, my tech brothers, I've been here before and it wasn't so good. And I don't really want a metaverse. You'd think I do, but I really don't. What I want is a better verse, because the first time for me and many others wasn't so great. So let's do it right this time. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. Now, I absolutely get the big hope. I got into the tech industry when I was just 15 in 1981. And I absolutely remember the genuine magic of computers, of seeing something I'd never before seen, of creating something and having that become real. I got into tech. Well, there really was no computer then, but I got into tech when I was 5. And I know that seems like a stretch, but let me explain why. So that's when I first started making games, and I was just a kid. There I am there. In my family, we didn't have a lot of money at all. And so we would go to a lot of yard sales or boot sales or flea markets, depending on where you're from. And at those, my mother would give me a dime. And with that dime, I could go buy a game, hopefully. But it turns out you really can't buy a game with all of its parts for a dime. And so instead, what I would get would be these pieces. And I would collect pieces and I would make my own games. And this taught me the fundamentals of system design. I got Dungeons and Dragons when I was 11. My mother got it for me somehow, having obviously not read the news. And I had, it's impossible to understate the effect that this had on me. I could create worlds. Now, they weren't digital worlds yet, but the feeling was there. And that's why I think when I saw Stranger Things for the first time, I absolutely fell in love with it. I was all of these kids. I was awkward. I was unpopular. And all those kids felt like me. They wanted to go on adventures in another verse, whether that was an analog verse or a metaverse or whatever it was. I eventually got into Rollmaster, and I didn't like the rules for encumbrance. And so I started changing them. And the next thing you know, I had rewritten the entire system. And at this point in time, I feel like I'm just getting ready for the metaverse that's to come. Now, it's 1981, and I get into the game industry. I'm hired into the game industry by another young female game developer, actually. This is the first game I worked on. It was Wizardry, Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord. This might not look like state of the art, but in 1981, it absolutely was. And my mother was so proud of me. Like, she pushed me out there. She really wanted me to get access to technology that we simply could not afford. And I fell head first in love with programming. If I had to do it 2 times, I would code it. For me, programming was far more creative than the Legos I could not afford, but I could get access to this machine through school and through work. It's where in the game industry, it's where I met my first husband. Here he is, the Apple II. And it's also where I met my second husband, and here he is. And he's John Romero, the creator of Doom, Quake, and many others. And I well remember hearing the term cyberspace, a term that is kind of just synonymous with the internet now. But when it first came out, the first time I heard cyberspace, it was really a promise. It was about all these things that we could do, a place we would connect, the possibility of what computers could do. William Gibson, I'm sure many of you know this, he coined the term in 1982 in an Omni magazine article, and he called it a consensual hallucination, which is I think a pretty good description of what being online is. And he greatly expanded it in his groundbreaking 1984 novel, Neuromancer. And he also, in this novel, he warns us about the dark side, this AI going rogue and wrong. Mind you, so we're at 1984. At this point in time, I have yet to play, and I'm in the game industry, I have yet to play a female character in any world, like any world, virtual world at all. All the humans that were in games or online up to that point in time were all men. You could not even play as a female character. But let me tell you about some of the things you could play as. You could play as Pac-Man, an alligator, a kangaroo, train rat, mouse, a police mouse, snake, paintbrush, crush roller, tank, bear, marble, rocket, silo, ball, car, airplane, clown. You're kind of getting the idea. You could play as Godzilla, a pool ball, a fish, a ghost, as long as that ghost was a male ghost. You just couldn't play as a woman. So at this point in time, you can't. So I think when I look at it from this perspective, I also see with the big hope, there's kind of a big problem that I don't get to play as myself. In all the virtual worlds that I'm seeing and all this cyberspace and this metaverse, I can't actually be me. And in fact, the first time that I had an opportunity to be me was in 1987. And this was the game, Leather Goddesses of Phobos, of all things. So you could say it was the very beginning of the game industry, and that, you know, it takes time for these things to arise, except it wasn't. Video games have been around since the 50s, and playable on platforms that all of us would have access to. Here's Pong, and since 1972. So you could choose your character, but nothing says you don't quite belong, like an all-male cast of characters. And so if you want to be in a good, if you want to be a woman in a game world, it's we're not even seeing them there. It's little wonder that we have a shortage of strong female leads. So this is a shot from a game, Ico. And Ico is a beautiful game, and it plays wonderfully as well. However, it's also a game where a guy basically drags this female character through a world to save her. And even our most iconic characters, like Princess Peach, for instance, and Mario, she needs to be rescued. But like, what if she was a self-rescuing princess, or maybe she was the one doing the rescuing? And it's not just in the past either. Like, this goes right up to today, including the 2020s, right? Even though we've just started. In fact, if you Google game protagonist, this is the first half of the image you get. So, you know, this kind of scarred white guy who hasn't shaved for a day or two. And this is the second half of the image you get. So like, it's not the most diverse group. Even Assassin's Creed Unity in 2014 decided you couldn't play as a female character. And the reason that they gave for this was it was just additional work. So they cut female assassins, which did in fact lead to some amazing cosplay, as you can imagine. And then esports also found themselves in a tricky situation. There was a tournament that decided not to let female players in, but like within, they wanted to have it so men versus men, women versus women, sort of keeping with the standard Olympic sports theme. But within 24 hours, this was undone. And when we did start appearing in virtual worlds, this is what we looked like. I don't know about you, but when danger strikes, this is not how I get dressed. Like, I don't go into my closet and look for my chainmail bikini. And if we think about making heroes, our heroes, we want them to be strong and buff. But interestingly enough, what happens, how it's split between men and women doesn't necessarily work. Like, here's kind of what we often see with our heroes, which, okay, this is what we normally see, but women have this additional thing, which is they show signs of arousal in sexual receptivity. Like, this tends to be in a fair number of games. And so this is what we see here. And we'll see full red lips, heavy lids, heavy breathing, erect nipples, probably not something you thought you were going to hear somebody talk about this morning, but that's what I'm here for. And you can see, like, this works for women, but we don't see this for men, right? So you end up with characters like this that are in video games, right? And to me, like, this just looks painful, frankly, like a couple, I don't know, water balloons or something. And not only do we dress women in ridiculously provocative outfits, right? Like, they also are showing scientific signs of sexual arousal. Like, all of these characters are from video games. And these characters aren't dressed to go out into a dungeon. Like, they are not dressed how I would choose to go on an adventure. And if we compare this with a couple male classic heroes, we can see that the issues of sexual arousal just don't exist. And in fact, I can't beat the meme here. So if men were dressed like women, can you imagine having characters like this in your game worlds, right? Like, it's just an awkward thing. And so I remember my first trip to an actual metaverse. It was Second Life. And it was, frankly, it was amazing. I'm like, my goodness, that is actually somebody else in some other computer walking toward me. But even then, I noticed things, that women were heavily sexualized. And that was actually the standard costume. And let me just be clear, I have no problem with sex or sexualizing anything, but at least I would like this choice, right? Like, I don't want to go into a world and go, well, here's your thong. Like, we should have an opportunity to have other things, right? And I remember when Anish Chung, she was a woman who made tons of money she made real world money in virtual real estate, she was one of the first to do this. Like, so much so that she was cover of a magazine famous, just for the exploits that she had and the money that she was making. And so she appeared on a talk show in Second Life itself, which was hosted by CNET. And she was attacked by basically a wave of dicks, right? So, like, this is just this isn't going so well. And of course, it's not just women. It's people of color. It's LGBTQI folks. It's anyone who's an other who will struggle to find themselves in games at all. In fact, in the original Sims, gay characters couldn't marry or even fall in love. And a game named Bully, when it was released, it was mired in controversy because a male character could, and I hope everybody's sitting down for this, brace yourselves, a male character could kiss another male character if the player chose to. Like, and this game nearly got an AO rating because of that. And in a virtual world, World of Warcraft, which is probably one of the biggest and most successful virtual worlds, it's had 2 run-ins at least with LGBTQI folks. So in both cases, Blizzard basically told guilds to change their names because the name of the guild was causing harassment, right? So in a recent case, they said you've got to change your name. Your in-game name is inappropriate, right? So, you know, their solution is kind of what, like, get back in the closet. It's for your own good. Like, that, it doesn't really make sense to me. Wonderfully, the gay community protested they shouldn't have had to protest, in fairness. The gay community protested in both cases, the first in 2006. And both were the very first instances that I'm aware of a civil rights protest in a virtual world. So they held marches, they had parades, they even held a gay cruise in protest of these policies. And if you're a person of color, well, do I have a surprise for you? Here's what was often added. It's what I like to call the brown slider. And seemingly, this should solve it all if you're a person of color. I don't mean that. Like it should solve it all, or maybe they thought it would, if you're okay looking like a 100% European Caucasian person with brown skin. And so you end up with horror shows that, you know, like characters that don't have any of the features you would expect, right? Like this is obviously not quite doing it. And then my daughter actually shared this with me, and she was saying that she saw this so many times when she was growing up that she could select her skin color, but she could have none of her facial attributes were there. It was just making an obviously European Caucasian character darker. I remember when my son was playing a game. He has my hair, but his father's skin color. And he could even adjust his glabella, which is this thing between your nose. And the only reason I know about that is because of games and because of this very situation. And he could adjust that. And but he could not make himself look like a mixed race kid. He wanted straight hair and dark skin, as if that combination was utterly unheard of, which of course it's not. And some games even celebrate incredibly outdated narratives. In fact, many European games, we would call them Euro games, board games, are about farming and colonizing. And it's here perhaps that it's most interesting, because while many games have historical context and feature colonization, resource production, and territorial acquisition, they leave out entirely the historical context of slavery and the theft of native lands and resources within them. And we have a similar issue in the Civilization series, in which barbarians are invariably Black and the colonizers are invariably white. And games are a mirror of the people who make them. So this was taken from the International Game Developers. And you can see that people of African descent don't even appear on this list. And so perhaps it's not surprising that the mechanics and narratives that we find in games are largely one-sided. And again, Caucasians represent 81% of people making games. So it's not a surprise they're one-sided, and I think that's hugely problematic, given that games are the most popular form of media among our youth. So fortunately, all that said, things are changing in virtual worlds, and they're changing for the better, whether it's somebody like Ellie from Last of Us or Lilith from Borderlands, or an actual love story in a game like Gone Home. Game protagonists are changing and for the better, and I think that's important because we all want heroes. And so what does this mean for the metaverse and for who makes it? The world we live in, both digital and physical, is built on cultural and societal considerations. Our metaverses are mirrors of those creators. So what gets left out and what gets brought in? And so I don't want a metaverse. I really want a betterverse. And so how do we do that? Well, I think we need to diversify the makers. So speaking from my own experience as a woman, I know that there are literally millions of us in technology. We're half the population, but we're less than a third of tech workers. And of those workers, only a fifth of us are in leadership positions. And that means the influence that we have on product development and company strategy is kind of small. And the results of that for our health and our well-being, our education, and our enjoyment are non-trivial. So if I take a look at something like, say, the Xbox controller, I'll start kind of light here. This controller, when it was the original, when it was first released, they called it Fatty in the Duke. And here it is in some guy's hands. And this is what it looked like in mine, or at least it felt like in mine. It was monstrous, this thing. Game Informer actually called it the blunder of the year, and they later released the Japanese controller worldwide. And the reason for this is that hand sizes do matter. The average female hand, not surprisingly, is smaller than the average male hand. And how this comes into play is when we think about our connection to metaverses or to betterverses, we are consistently heading toward larger and larger screens. And the reality is those screens don't fit every hand. And Apple actually discontinued the phone which best fits the average female hand. And so you could say, who cares? What does this matter? Except it looks great in this picture, but the reality is it doesn't fit as well in the hand. And so women drop their phones in situations where you might need your phone in an emergency. It becomes more difficult to manage that. And even other people have said things like, welcome to the big screens, but not actually doing other things that would make things better for all. And what's considered standard size should account for all their customers. And that would go, I'm not trying to just pick on Apple here, because this affects everybody. In June of 2019, I, along with many other women, were excited by their addition of cycle tracking. So this was fantastic. It tracks both your menstrual cycles and your fertility. So finally, this thing is coming. And the thing I couldn't help but thinking about is, like, health kit's been out for 5 years at this point in time. Why is this just getting added? There are 2 billion women in this age group, and even Disney had talked about it in 1946. I mean, it's a thing, it's a normal thing, right? Like, incidentally, this was also the first use of the word vagina in a film. I'm sure other things you probably weren't expecting to hear about this morning, but again, that's what I'm here for. So it's even gotten into our AI. So if the gender is female, and you may have heard of Amazon's recruitment engine. So Amazon, obviously, they're masters of automation, and it makes sense that they would likewise automate their hiring process. And so their AI was trained using resumes that they'd received over the last 10 years. And the problem is that most of those resumes were from men. Right? So now, I'm not saying this clearly wasn't an intentional thing, but we can see how AI would develop this. And if you are hiring, if most of your resumes are from men, then in all likelihood, most of your hires are going to be the same thing. And so what you see is the successful resumes often didn't have term like women's tech society, or women's, I don't know, chess group or whatever, and women's colleges. So these things actually would get decremented. This program was retired in 2018, fortunately. In 2017, a group of academics decided to review bias in open source computing, the very thing that builds our virtual worlds. And this was fantastic. They found out that women's contributions were rated higher and accepted more often than men, unless their gender was known. And if their gender was known, it dropped by 20%. And it's a whole other world for people of color. Like, Snapchat has clearly struggled to have filters that are designed for non-white faces. And Black people have also had issues of racial discrimination in Zoom bombing. This one is one of them this one is way out there. So it was also removing people's heads. So Colin Madland was trying to figure out what might be wrong, and one of his colleagues was complaining that his head just wasn't showing up. So he decided to call him to find out what was happening. And when he did, he figured out what it was and why it was. So his colleague's head would show up if he had a globe or something like that behind him. And according to Colin, it turned out that Zoom has crappy face detection algorithms that erase Black faces and determines that a nice pale globe in the background must be a better face than what should be obvious. It only seemed to work when there was a light-colored globe behind his head, and this is hardly new. I mean, it's shocking and devastating. And US government tests have found that even top performing facial recognition systems misidentify Blacks at rates 5 to 10 times higher than they do whites. And it can have some pretty severe ramifications. People have been jailed for such things. And technology we built perpetuates the racism that we are trying to escape. We've trained AI, surveillance AI, to look for dark faces. Algorithms that determine credit score disproportionately assess Black people as risks. And this isn't me going deep here, like by any stretch of the imagination. This information is everywhere. And while this is exceptionally disheartening, I also believe it's engineered. And if it's engineered, I know it can be changed. If the makers are in the mirror, we can create better worlds. And it's about getting to equal. Diverse teams are better in work and education. And we need to clear away the barriers that are keeping people out. And so how do we get rid of those? Well, as a woman, I will speak to my experience. I know that there are barriers that could have kept me out, myths that I could have chosen to believe, like girls don't play games, for instance, even though women and people of color own the most consoles. Or that girls aren't good at maths and IT. Well, in fact, they're just as good at maths and IT unless they're told they're not. And like any kid, regardless of their gender, they'll start to believe it. And if we're talking about making the metaverse, women, including women of color, quite literally built the DNA of this metaverse and its foundations. Like Margaret Hamilton, who's a rock star. This is the woman, and standing next to the code, that literally put men on the moon. And she did this while being a mom. She did this while her kid was in the lab. Or Lois Mitchell, whose work was instrumental on Fortran, or Frances Allen, who built the optimizing compiler, for which she won the Turing Award. Or Kathleen Booth, who built the first assembly language. Or Melba Roy, who was NASA's computer. Or, believe it or not, Sister Mary Kenneth Keller, whose work was instrumental to BASIC. Or Kay McNulty, who worked on the ENIAC with an all-female programming team. This computer that we often talk about being the very first computer, women ran this, women coded this. Or Alexandra Forsythe, who actually wrote the very first computer science textbook and co-founded with her husband the first computer science course. We've always been there. Computer science was founded by women. And I would say if we want to build a better verse, we also need to curate the community. It has been a difficult few years. And I'll speak on my own side. For women in game development, there have been death threats and swatting and personal information revealed online. And that's just the stuff you know about. Behind the scenes are some really scary stuff. I have certainly been the subject of harassment. Such exciting things as, you know, it'd be better if they could spell, but, you know, could they snap my neck too? And I have to turn away from it and turn my back to it and just shut the door on it. A friend of mine recently said, as a woman online, it's like sticking your head into a garbage can and breathing deep. And it's a world that divides us from one another. And I believe deeply that communities can be cultivated and curated, and that curation should favor people over profit. So that's what I want. I don't want this metaverse thing. I want a better verse, because the first time for me and others wasn't so good. I believe we can do it. I know we can do it. I want a better verse. I want to not forget about people of color or put people in boxes that they don't want to be in. I want a better verse where we welcome our differences and build a world that's a reflection of who we see instead of what we want to see. I want a better verse where people cannot be attacked without recourse, or where conspiracies can't thrive and come alive. I want a better verse where the price of admission is not beyond the possibility of many, that lets everybody in. I want a better verse. I want a better verse where anybody can be who they want to be. I want a better verse. Thank you.